Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Bill Squadron, the president of Our Energy Policy, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on the state of long-duration energy storage. Hope everyone has been well and healthy, and we thank you for taking the time to be part of this discussion today. First off, I would like to thank our partners, Bracewell, the Grace Richardson Fund, National Grid, API, Con Edison, Jan Kaplan Fund, Ship Harden, US Grid, and our series underwriter BP for their support for this. Also want to thank all of our panelists and in particular our moderator Noel Bacteon, who I will introduce in a moment. We will have at the last third of the hour the opportunity for questions from you all in the audience. You'll note on your dashboard on the right, there is a questions tab. If you do have a question, submit it in writing and we will get to as many questions as we possibly can. But you should know that OEP will also host an online discussion that will allow you to weigh in on the topic that our speakers will be addressing today, and that will launch in the next 48 hours or so on our website. So that will be another opportunity to weigh in and have further discussion on this critical topic. And we are very pleased today to really have one of the world's experts moderating this discussion. Noel Bakhtian is the founder and executive director of the Berkeley Labs Energy Storage Center, where they work on applying and translating research into real-world solutions on storage. She has worked in the White House, at the Department of Energy, as the director of the Center for Advanced Energy Studies at the Idaho National Laboratories. So she will be moderating the conversation. And thank you again for joining us. And now we're going to turn it over to Noel and our very distinguished panel. Noel?
Thank you so much, Bill. And I'd like to welcome the rest of the panel to join me on video here. So welcome to everyone. Thanks to Our Energy Policy for hosting this really timely topic. I'm looking forward to a dynamic session. I'm only the steward of this brilliant panel, so I have the pleasure now of introducing our panelists. I'd like to start with Wesley Cole. He's the Senior Energy Analyst at the Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Wesley is a Senior Energy Modeler there and an analyst, where his work is centered really around improving understanding of how the US power system might evolve. He focuses on renewable energy integration, the role of energy storage, and the impacts of high renewable energy futures, all very relevant for today. Next, I'd like to introduce Mateo Jaramillo, who is the co-founder and CEO of Form Energy. Form Energy is developing a new class of multi-day energy storage systems that will enable a reliable, secure, and fully renewable electric grid year-round. Mateo was formerly the VP of Products and Programs for Tesla's Stationary Energy Storage Program, an effort that he started. In that role, he was responsible for Tesla Energy's product line and business model definition, as well as global policy and business development. Next, I'm excited to introduce Jan Pepper, CEO of Peninsula Clean Energy. Jan has over 30 years of energy and utility experience with a focus on renewable energy contracting and financing. She joined Peninsula Clean Energy as CEO in May 2016 as the first employee and has grown the organization to its current state. She formerly worked at Silicon Valley Power and has founded 4 energy-related startups. At APX, she developed and pioneered the first use of renewable energy credits, which are now the standard currency for trading and tracking renewable power. And finally, Eric Kim, Power Resources Planner at Silicon Valley Clean Energy. Eric supports and executes on behalf of SVCE for energy and capacity procurement. He also acts as a subject matter expert on energy storage systems and distributed energy resource integration. Most recently, he is leading the evaluation in the first of its kind long duration storage request for offers with a group of 8 community choice aggregators, which you'll probably hear more about later. Prior to joining SVCE, Eric worked for the California ISO in various departments, including new resource implementation, renewable integration, and market and infrastructure policy. So welcome to all of our incredible panelists. Thank you for joining us. And I think Eric hopefully will be joining us in just a few minutes. So just to set the stage for our audience here, let's talk about use cases for long duration energy storage. From your perspective, what are our current and future needs at different timescales for energy storage? Who wants to kick it off? Mateo,
I'm
I'm looking.
Oh, go ahead, Jan.
We'll figure out how to work this all out in this virtual environment. So thank you for having us here, and we're really excited to be able to talk about this really incredibly important subject this morning. So there's lots of different timescales that we need to be looking at. Here in California, right now, most of the energy storage is based on 4-hour storage because that's what qualifies for resource adequacy in California, and it also meets some of our short-term storage needs. But I think we're going to be looking at longer duration, like starting with 8-hour storage to even seasonal storage. So we need different types of storage to get us from day to day, but we also need to get from season to season. So as we know, when the sun goes down, the grid needs more power, and we need to be able to store some of that power that the solar generates during the day for our evening ramps. But also for us at Peninsula Clean Energy, we have a goal to be 100% renewable on a 24/7 basis in a few years. And in order to do that, we not only need to be able to store excess renewables generated during the day, but also generated during different seasons. So in the winter, for example, solar generates much less than in the summertime. Is there some way we can store that extra power that the solar is generating during the summer so that we can use it for winter use? So I think we're going to be looking at both daily and seasonal needs for storage.
Thank you, Jan.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in as well. Certainly we need to consider different timescales than just sort of the hours. And when you hear the term long duration storage, of course, it begs the immediate sort of follow-up question. Well, what is long duration? What sort of puts you in that category? Is it 8 hours? Is it 12 hours? Is it 2 months? And so certainly at Forum, we've started to be a little bit more precise about how we talk about the kind of storage that we are developing. And we refer to it now as multi-day storage to just be a little bit more precise there. Now, of course, we can ask, well, how many days, right? But at the very least, we're sort of in the bucket of multiple days there. We've done a lot of analytical work to really understand what you need in the system. And it's unlikely that we're going to need something like the biggest form of storage that we have today, which is, take California anyway, the thermal storage in the mountains, right? That's snow in the winter that very helpfully sort of melts over the course of the year and provides water and sort of the energy that comes from that. But I don't, Jan, I'll maybe parse the point a little bit. I don't think that what we need is to figure out a way to take an excess kilowatt hour of summer sun and move it into the winter. I think the real challenge here is to take the kilowatt hours coming from solar in the winter before the storm into the storm. That's really what we have. The variance summer to winter for solar in California anyway is it's a 2-to-1 factor. So we have about twice as many sun hours per day in summer as we do in winter. And that means that the sun doesn't go away entirely in winter, of course. It's a beautiful day outside here in Northern California today, nice and sunny. But we do have to account for that difference. On the other hand, we also need to take into account all the mix of resources that we expect to come online throughout the continued build out of the grid here. And so all of our modeling says that the real challenge is solving multiple days of storage, possibly up to a week. And we can talk about the ERCOT example that's very recent in everybody's mind. But all of our modeling says that what we don't need is something that goes one season into the next. It really is 1 week into the subsequent week. That's sort of where we have ended up.
Thanks, Mateo. Anyone else wanted to jump in on this one? I'll just mention that the California Energy Commission does define long duration energy storage as having at least 10 hours duration. So Mateo, to your point, maybe there's some interesting analyses or discussions we can be having with some of these policymakers. Okay, let's move to the next question. You mentioned ERCOT, Mateo. We're all following the ERCOT story right now and the emergency in Texas. I was wondering if our panelists could make the connection for our audience on the long duration energy storage implications here.
Well, I'm happy to elaborate a little bit more. I promise I won't hog the mic here. So to the point about defining the term 10 hours being sort of what California has put out there, that duration would have been insufficient to solve the big problem in Texas, right? That was a 7-day problem essentially. And so the question becomes, in many ways, the answer for how many hours we need is determined by the functionality we're trying to get to in the market. And if the functionality is how do you replace natural gas, or certainly from a renewables perspective, if your goal is to be able to replace natural gas, then you must have the ability to provide power for days on end. And Texas is sort of an extreme event there, but these are going to become more and more frequent. And so you do need something that is cost effective into the days regime. Let's put it at 7 days. Well, that's just shy of 200 hours. And so that's sort of, from an end state perspective, that is where we need to get ultimately from a quote unquote long duration storage definition. So, and that's always been what Forum is aiming for. That's we saw that as where the market was heading ultimately. And Texas is sort of a sad example for why that's needed sooner maybe than what we had originally thought. But certainly the multiple days is where things are ending up.
Thanks, Mateo. I was just reading that I think 2/3 of U.S. grid outages exceed 10-hour duration, which I thought was interesting. Wesley, looks like you might want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking that, looking at, I've been in lots of different conversations about ERCOT. I'm sure lots of people have, in terms of just what happened. And, the general story is all grid generators were impacted. But the interesting piece there was that solar actually did better than expected. There's just so little of it in Texas that it didn't really matter that it did well. But if California's grid mix was in Texas, then this idea of you need a week-long storage may have not been the case. If you were over-generating solar in the day, maybe you could have stored that, and then you would need that kind of 10-hour storage to make it through. But so it's a function both of your grid mix and the situations you're seeing. So that it's gonna be dependent on a lot of different conditions, which makes storage so fascinating and such a fun question to be working on.
Agreed. It is definitely a systems question.
Yeah, can I jump in there? And apologies, I had internet issues, and so I'm sorry that I joined late, but I'm glad to be a part of the discussion here. Yeah, I think, Wesley, you bring up a good point, is that when we talk about these outages we've seen out in Texas, it was the reason for this kind of week-long outage per se was because the grid wasn't able to solve the issues, right? And had to go into blackouts. But if the grid operator has the ability to maybe do rolling blackouts because it has sufficient supplies in different areas, not a complete lack of just supply, I think we're talking less about multi-day, but more of multiple hours. An example, and I also want to point out the fact that on a regional basis, there's going to be different needs here. California may only need 8 to 10 hours in terms of what long duration storage should be. But maybe on the East Coast or in the Midwest, when you have these kind of freak blizzards, winters, it does require longer multi-day. And I think we have to be very cognizant of that, is that each of these regions with its portfolios is really going to dictate what type of long duration storage we're defining here.
Thank you. That's a great point. And I think let's move now to starting to talk about technologies. So we know that there's a number of different existing technologies that are claiming to be long duration. We've got compressed air, we've got pumped hydro, we have gravity, lithium ion battery, but we also have research in the works for innovative new technologies. So I was wondering if the panel wouldn't mind providing their opinion on various options available and where you might see the most potential.
I can jump in here. So I think there's a lot of different use cases. So all of these different technologies solve for different types of issues that we're trying to solve. They all have different efficiencies. They have different, they use different types of materials. They have different environmental impacts. So there's a lot of different things to take into account here. And I think some are more likely to be able to be used in certain geographies than others. So having a mix is really a good thing. And it also depends on what we're talking about. So, what we're talking about with Texas was a few days outage because of the overall grid. What I was talking about with PCE, where we're trying to match our supply and our demand for renewables on an hourly basis throughout the year, that's a different kind of problem to solve. And maybe I should explain that a little bit differently. So when we look month by month at what is the generation profile of the mix of our portfolio versus our load, say if we contract for a lot of solar to meet our winter needs in December, then we're way over procured for solar in the summer because it produces so much more. So either we find a different resource that can get us through the winter months, or we somehow or other figure out how to use that solar that we don't need in the summer and be able to spread that out over a longer period of time. So that's what I was meant to convey in my earlier comments about the different kinds of uses and the different kinds of needs for how to store that power.
Thanks, Jen. Anyone want to talk about flow batteries or hydrogen or any of these new technologies coming out?
Maybe not commenting on technology specifically, but I do think that the market will want multiple solutions that have different combinations of specifications, because that's how you get to the lowest cost. And the example very helpfully comes from the natural gas industry, right? We have open cycle gas plants and we have combined cycle gas plants, and those two things complement each other very nicely in terms of the functionality and of course the costs. And so lithium ion is the fixture on the grid right now. It will only continue to be deployed at great volumes. And so in many ways, the consideration for what else is going to show up on the grid should be, well, what complements lithium ion best? Because to get to that solution set, Jan, that you're talking about, so that you're not massively overbuilding in one season, and then having just barely sufficient resources in the low season. The way you get to the lowest possible cost of the system to do that is by having a combination of storage assets that have different characteristics. And so lithium ion will be a piece, and what complements that piece most nicely, again, that's what Form is going after. So I would say no matter what the approach, it should take into account how that thing is going to complement lithium ion. I think it's a really tough road to hoe to compete with lithium ion on its own terms, which is sub 1 day high efficiency at those costs. And the costs are going to come down tremendously. So anybody who expects to be competitive in the, let's call it up to 20 hours, better have a real entitlement to beating lithium ion. I think that's a really hard path to go down. So in many ways, it's, the question is what can complement it from the other end, which is maybe on a lower efficiency standpoint, but is cost effective over multiple days. And we can debate how many days we think we need there, but those two things go together. And so hydrogen is certainly a possible approach there. I'll take Form out of it for a second. Hydrogen can come in and provide those multiple days of storage at a lower efficiency, but from a $1 per kilowatt hour CapEx standpoint, much lower cost. So you could conceive of those, pairing nicely. And you're already seeing some people looking at projects there, the DWTP project in Utah, which would aim to do that kind of thing. But I think it's going to be a portfolio approach, and two types of assets probably.
I think you make a really great point there, Mateo. At Berkeley Lab, in fact, we're in the middle of doing a study that's doing that cost comparison study, because that's exactly what we need to be comparing against. I've been learning a lot about energy storage recently, specifically for long duration. And one thing I've been hearing more about is how flow batteries are able to separate the cost for the specific energy and the specific power, which is kind of neat when you're thinking about long duration. The other thing, as far as new interesting technologies we're working on at Berkeley Lab, is thermal energy. We just started a whole new office on thermal energy. We see a lot of potential for buildings, for industrial loads, for long duration. And the basic premise is you can take the cheap, clean energy from the grid, you convert it to heat, you store it in very cheap materials, and our big project is all about optimizing those materials right now. And you can store these at like lava-like temperatures, which is safe because the energy is already stored in the form of heat. There's nowhere else for it to go. And then you can use that heat directly for energy uses, or you can convert it back to electricity For instance, using thermovoltaics. We're in fact working with a cool company that hopefully a lot of you have heard about already called OurEnergy. They're an ARPA-E backed company. We also funded them through Cyclotron Road at Berkeley Lab, our tech accelerator at Berkeley Lab. And they've broken the world record on efficiency for converting back from thermal to electricity. So there's all these cool ideas right now that could be ready, not tomorrow, but in some time for our long duration needs as we're trying to get the grid to, 100% renewable.
If it's all right, I'd like to just jump in here too, is as many probably already know, and we're going to answer this later and give a little description, but Jan PCE and SPCE is part of an RFO, a long duration storage RFO. So we can't really go into too specifics out of respect to the process, but I could speak in generalities is that there's a lot of technologies out there. We received over 18 different types of technologies. And every one, I think, our approach is that we want to be technology agnostic, but be aware of what Mateo is saying is that there's different applications. And the solution is definitely not a silver bullet, as we know, in a high renewable portfolio grid. You can't have one to rule them all. And so I think it's an interesting kind of point I want to make is that lithium ion definitely is the major player. SVC alone, we signed over 160 megawatts of 4-hour capacity of lithium ion, and we'll continue to do so because that's kind of what is out there in the market. But one thing that is limiting of lithium ion, that technology, is the limitations on its cycling count. In a day, a 4-hour battery can usually get about 1 to maybe 2 cycles, so that's a full charge and a discharge. That limits us a lot, and I think that limits the grid a lot when that battery is running up against different warranty issues. So this is where the newer types of technologies has to focus on the ability to maybe provide, and this is maybe not in the context of a long duration storage either. Even if it's shorter duration, can it focus on multiple cycles a day? Because as we know in practice, these technologies, storage technologies, aren't necessarily moving large tranches of energy. What we think of in the middle of the day charging, discharging in the evening, it realistically doesn't really work that way in the California market. It's providing a lot of different services like regulation, where it's moving in small capacities throughout the day during certain periods, and doesn't necessarily have to be in that evening ramp. So I think that's a key point that I think these newer technologies should be focusing on, and we see it. We see it in everything from chemical flows to hydrogen. There's a lot of these kind of maximum, a high number of cycling, which is really important to the grid.
Thank you so much, Eric. And since you mentioned it, it's really interesting, this coalition of community choice aggregators that have come together, including Peninsula Clean Energy and Silicon Valley Clean Energy, to release this first major request for proposals for long duration projects. Eric, can you or Jan talk a little bit more about the process it took to get there to actually be able to release this? Because it's pretty innovative.
I'll let Jan take it as the CEO of PCE to start it off, and I'll add any supplemental information on there.
Yeah, we've been, I don't know if people are familiar with this community choice aggregator model in California, but basically we are the electricity provider, and we replace the IOU as far as the generation portion of the bill. And right now I think there are 23 CCAs operating in California. And so 8 of us in Northern California have created a new joint powers agency to do joint procurement for large types of projects. And this is kind of modeled after what has occurred in the municipal utility field, where there's Northern California Power Agency, where there's a number of munis that have banded together to do large projects. So similarly, we're doing the same thing in the CCA space, because we can do a larger project that would be too big for any one of us to do, but collectively makes sense for us to do. And the size of this JPA that's been put together so far is just slightly larger now than what PG&E is procuring in the market. We represent about 40% of PG&E's load, over 30 terawatts. We cover 140 municipalities, ranging from Humboldt County in the very north and going down to Santa Barbara County in the south and going inland. So it's a very large organization. And because of that, we're hoping that we're going to have some ability to get some economies of scale because of our size. So the first project that we're looking at is long duration energy storage as part of the integrated resource planning exercise that we do in California for Public Utilities Commission. Storage is a part of that, and all of us in our IRPs indicated how much long duration storage we would need to meet our needs. And so collectively, we're all working together to do this. We issued the RFP in October. The bids came in December. 51 entities submitted 314 unique pricing offers. And as Eric noted, lots of different technologies. All of the technical folks are going through those proposals right now. We expect to have a short list together next month. We'll be doing negotiations in the summer and hopefully coming to PPAs by the fall. I'm sure Eric can provide more detail about what's come in and as much as we're willing to disclose at this point, and what kinds of options we're seeing there. But it's very exciting, and it's great to get this information about what's out there, what the pricing is, and what makes sense, because of course the pricing is very critical as well.
Yeah, Jan covered it all, and I think that's it's basically sums up where we are in the process. Just a little bit more about that evolution, though, is we as the joint CCAs, and there was quite a few more, I think about 13 CCAs that did a request for information back in June of last year. And so it was it was to understand where the market was, but it was also to send a signal in order to prepare for this October RFO that we did release. It provided us a lot of good information, and I would say even the current process right now, like I mentioned, 18 technologies, over 300 unique offers. I mean, that is showing that the market is ready, and that others who are willing to participate in a similar type of RFO, RFP will see a large amount of choices. But I think one of the biggest things in our opinion here to focus on is the cost effectiveness. Being kind of one of the first movers for long duration storage. And here, to Mateo's point, Mateo and Form is looking at a multi-day. We set this as a minimum of 8 hours. And that's really our first stab at what long duration storage is, but we don't want to limit the fact that long duration storage can be defined as much longer than that. But for the time being, we're doing this because it's relatively, it's comparable to what you traditionally have as your pump storage. But to state that, we didn't see just 8, we saw 10, 12, 16, and multi-day. It really is a tremendous kind of effort that all the developers, but also the CCAs we're trying to establish here, and really come up with the right solution, because we know that our current storage capabilities at the moment that's on the grid is not enough. And when we come up with, especially in California, hot summers, low hydro years, we're gonna need these storage solutions. So we're really excited. Leading a great team of, again, all these 8 CCAs, including ourselves, and we're looking forward to negotiating with some of the developers that may even be on this call here. But that's all I want to add. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, huge congratulations to you, Eric, and to you, Jan. This is very big, and I know a lot of folks are going to have eyes on you and how this process unfolds, and can't wait to learn best practices on the tail end of this. So congratulations.
And,
you mentioned.
Can I just chime in real fast on something Eric you mentioned? I mean, without commenting on anything that we participated in, the RFP was I would say, just as a participant, it was well structured. There was a lot of freedom there. And it was exactly the kind of thing that as a new technology that you want to see, right? There wasn't too much that was predetermined. And Eric mentioned cycling, for example. There's a tendency out there, broadly speaking, not with the CCAs to be clear, but broadly speaking, to sort of have lithium ion determine the conversation around storage always. So for efficiency or cycling or whatever else it may be, people always just refer back to what lithium-ion wants to do. And cycling, for example, although very important for daily applications, is much less relevant when you're talking about something that is much longer duration, for example. So if I have a weeks-long battery that it takes a week to discharge it and a week to charge it, well, that means the theoretical maximum number of cycles I can get is 26 over the course of a year. And over the course of 25 years, we're talking about 500 to 600 cycles, right? Maximum that I could theoretically get. So cycles are no longer a part of the conversation. And I think this is it's something that the procuring entities need to be aware of so that they don't channel unintentionally into terms set by lithium-ion, let's say, for what the grid needs, right? We really should be evaluating things, to the point that both Jan and Eric made around price effectiveness. And the only way to sort of compare features between batteries is in a financial model. You can't really just look at a spec sheet and say this battery is better than this other battery. You have to model them in real world applications and in a financial model, for whoever the relevant folks are for that one. So I just want to commend, the CCAs for the way that they went about building that RFO and having a lot of degrees of freedom there to really get the new entrants into the market.
Sounds like that could really be. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Noel. This has been really interesting because I'm just thinking back, like 10 years ago, a lot of our renewable energy integration work was like, hey, look, storage is expensive, you don't need it. And we went about trying to debunk the myth that to put more renewables on, you had to have storage. And I heard two people already say about need storage kind of thing. And it's really fascinating because storage has come down so much in cost. Storage is part of the least cost solution for building out the grid now, where it wasn't really 10 years ago. And I think that dramatic change over not that long of time in the electric sector's lifetime is part of why this is so important, is because that needs to continue to happen. If we just kind of make rules of thumb and say, oh, storage is too expensive, we don't worry about it, then you miss opportunities. And now if you say, oh, lithium ion is the way to go, you can miss opportunities. So it's really, I really like what Mateo said. You really have to do the engineering. Like this isn't just, the electricity system isn't simple, and it changes quite rapidly now. So it's been really fascinating to watch.
Agreed. When you think about innovation in the world, a lot of times what brings on new paradigm shifts is thinking about what technology has changed or what cost has just jumped so far down that now it can enable all kinds of new things. And that's exactly what you're saying, Wesley, on storage. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to be stepping back and looking at the whole system again and saying, what assumptions were we making before and what should we be rethinking because of this incredible technology shift? So that's exciting. Mateo, I actually want to go back to you. Forum Energy made headlines last year for your project with Great River Energy in Minnesota, which is going to push storage to 150 hours. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about that project.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. I'll also add on to what you just said. Not only do we need to revisit the assumptions, we have to make sure that we have the right tools to model the new grid that we're entering into. And so that we're involved in a project, a CEC granted project with E3, the consultancy, to develop a new version of the Resolve model for California, the reference IRP model, to basically provide higher fidelity modeling for the future grids. So that's a really important piece as well. And everybody needs to be able to use those tools for the integrated resource planning. And I bring that up because that was the basis for that GRE project, the Great River Energy, which is a generation transmission co-op in Minnesota. They have about 1 million customers, and they serve their member co-op, the member retail co-ops. It's an interesting utility. They own a coal plant currently, a 1,200 megawatt coal plant. They also have a high voltage DC line that they own. They have gas, combined cycle, open cycle. They have wind, a lot of wind. Not very much solar, but they will go build a lot more solar. Solar is now cost effective in Minnesota, which it wasn't even a few years ago. And they're exposed to the market. They're part of MISO. And so a very interesting mix of conditions there. And the big challenge is that coal plant called Coal Creek Station, actually in North Dakota, is getting retired. And the question is, how do they deal with that loss of that generator in their system? Do they want to be exposed on the market side? How do they go build more wind, which is sort of at capacity given current state of things right now. It is a lot of congestion and curtailment in their system, and so they need a different kind of storage to help them out go build that new generation capacity. So that's where Form stepped in. The type of thing they were looking for just wasn't available, and a few hours of lithium ion doesn't meaningfully solve the problem for them. It is a problem of energy, not a problem of power, all right? And so they're looking for an energy storage system, which translates into sort of multiple days. And they're very well familiar with the polar vortex, right? Which was new to Texas, of course, but Minnesota has that now with regularity, and there's basically 4 days of lull on the wind and really cold temperatures, and they've weatherized their gas fleet, so they tend to do okay, but they still have problems. And so that had always been the duration that they're looking at, right? Those multiple days. And so it was a great fit for us. But we spent, a good year and a half on the analytics side of things to really deeply understand the challenge of what they were trying to solve, and fit that with the right technical solution. Form didn't start out with a technology in mind and then sort of try and bring it into the market. We really started out with a characterization of the problem, and then said, okay, if that's the best problem to solve, then what should we go develop on the hardware side of things? And that's really where we came at it. And when we started the company in about 3 years ago, it was with a couple of options in mind, and then we ended up down selecting to the technology that we are commercializing now. But that was the basis of a lot of work, analytical work, to really understand what is differentiated, what is truly unique, and what solves the biggest problem. And therefore, since we're entrepreneurs, goes after to the biggest opportunity, right? This is $1 trillion market to go after. If we can solve the very low cost multi-day storage problem. So that's where we went, and GRE is a great partner. They must come up with a solution, right? And the utility industry is far from monolithic, as we know well from CCAs and IOUs and everything in between. And so what we do is we work with the right utilities, and GRE was just, they're the ones that really wanted to move quickly and had a big problem that they thought that we could help them solve. And they committed to us early, and so we're driving towards that pilot project. It'll be built in 2 years.
Wow, congratulations, Mateo. That's big. Congrats. Let's see, we're coming down to the last 1 or 2 questions here before we open it up to the audience. So I want to turn to Wesley. Wesley, at NREL, you and your fellow co-authors recently released the first report in the Storage Futures Study series, which is examining the role and impact of storage in the evolution and operation of the US power sector. I was wondering if you could share a little bit with the audience about this work and what's in store for the sector.
Yeah, you give me 2 things here. I want to get to the audience question because this is going to be really fascinating, and I could talk about this for 3 hours. So I'll go short here. So the summary is that storage is a super exciting area where there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of potential, and like you were saying earlier, that storage used to not be part of a least cost solution when we were looking at futures, and now it's part of every least cost solution that we look at. And the types of storage vary, and the needs for storage vary, and the opportunities for storage vary, but there's lots of opportunity. And in our storage future study, we're basically looking at those opportunities, trying to quantify them, and provide some ways to think about how does storage deployment happen? What does 100 gigawatts of storage look like? What kind of durations might we see, and how might that transition in different parts of the country? Because it is dependent on the underlying systems. There's specific needs in different areas, and different load shapes in different areas, and different resource mixes, and all of those come into play with storage. Storage is so interesting because it doesn't actually make any electricity like a generator does. It relies on the grid to get that energy. So it's doubly dependent on the grid. It depends on it to charge and to discharge, and that makes it just a really fascinating piece that operates differently than other resources. So I'll keep it at that because I'm interested in getting to what kind of questions are coming in.
Thanks, Wesley. Can you tell the audience where they'd be able to find this report and the following ones coming out?
If you just Google NREL Storage Futures Study, you'll find everything that you need. Google's great for finding things.
Sounds good. Thank you. And I think for our last question here before we open it up to the audience, I was wondering if the panelists or whoever is interested in answering this one could talk about maybe the greatest need for policy support in this sector, or what recommendations you have for policies, or what you'd want to inform policymakers of in the storage space to really help advance long duration energy storage, especially given we have the Department of Energy's Energy Storage Grand Challenge that opened up in the last year.
Well, I think in general for policies, what works best, what we've seen that works best in the past, is to be technology agnostic, is to not specify what's needed. Maybe, you know, specify what the parameters are of what we're looking for, but allow the market to develop what's needed rather than have a prescriptive requirement.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I would say in particular, what we need are to describe what's needed a little bit more precisely. There's a lot of things that are needed that are basically underdefined in the market today, like reliability. So how do we provide reliability, a much more precise definition and value in the market, so that we can take a tech neutral approach to solving those reliability challenges. So that's one area in particular that I think on the policy side we could use some help with as we try and define sort of what the desired end state is of the grid. There will be some additional products that are needed in the market, and by product I mean like wholesale energy market products.
And I'll just add on to that, Mateo, and something you mentioned before is, I'm not going to prescribe policy here, of course, from a national lab, but just something I've been trying to get educated on is the biases that we might have when we're looking at data, when we're looking at our analyses, when we're making these decisions, like the 4-hour resource adequacy thing, or the fact that a lot of our grid planning tools right now don't involve multi-year modeling, and that might adversely affect long duration as well.
Yep.
Yeah,
that's right.
I think exposure for everyone involved in this, Wesley's point with storage is no longer a one-sided thing. It's a collaborative effort by the grid operators, the regulators, and the buyers, developers, right? In our process, learning through this RFI and RFO, the CCAs, we've shopped this around to the DOE, to our regulators at the Public Utilities Commission, the Energy Commission, the California ISO, and it's giving them the exposure that, look, these technologies are coming in. We have a whole host of technologies with these various durations. You have to be aware of this, that it's no longer a 4-hour game. It's no longer just a lithium ion game. And I think that does a lot to the individual kind of, you know, thinkers on those teams, those who are actually designing these market models or policies, to realize that they have to look beyond than what they currently see in front of them. So I think that's a really key thing here is we need a regulatory certainty as well, though, as an LSC, as a buyer, is that when we think about capacity, we can't procure based off of a potential of a mandate to come in place. Because if we go ahead and sign a 10, 15, 20-year contract and we're stuck with a construct where it's still a 4-hour storage requirement, we've put in a lot of risk there. And so that's something that we, as the joint CCAs, as we're going through this RFO process, is really asking on our regulators to think further down the line and try to give some sort of regulatory certainty for the market's sake.
Yeah,
This is Kevin with Our Energy Policy. I hate to jump in and interrupt, but we do want to jump to Q&A session here before we run out of time. We have more than a few questions lined up. So,
sounds great. Take it away, Kevin.
Thank you very much for the presentation. We certainly appreciate it. The first question here is actually a combination of two. We had a question from Andrew Patterson as well as Charles McCombie regarding the state of the industry, I guess you could say, in terms of storage today. So the first question is, how much storage can be built today in gigawatt hours? And the second is, what are the biggest grid scale lithium ion storage systems at present? If anyone's aware of the answer, we can move on if we're not quite sure.
Well, I'll chime in on how much storage can be built. I mean, there's no talking of lithium ion as the dominant chemistry that's out there today or technology. There's no discussion of grid storage from lithium ion without also talking about capacity on the automotive side of things. That's what's driving that industry by far. In many ways, the grid application for lithium ion is the tail and the dog is the automotive industry. You know, that if you look at the total number of gigawatt hours needed, to meaningfully change the picture in terms of electric vehicles. It's massive, absolutely massive. And so that really is what's driving it. In large part, looking at what happens on the pricing, for example, with lithium-ion grid storage systems, it depends on sort of availability out of that industry, broadly speaking. And sometimes, the automotive industry is vacuuming up everything. And so, you sort of have to sort of see what availability would look like out of those same production facilities. So I think there's not a precise answer for how much you could go build if you really wanted to right now. I think that picture will change over the next 5 to 10 years a lot right now. But I would say we're underbuilding probably, if anything, for what the market would prefer to go build. As far as the largest systems, I think one of the largest ones certainly is the Moss Landing project that just was commissioned recently in PG&E territory, and that's I forget what the total is, 800 megawatts maybe for our system.
I'll throw a California perspective in there. The California Energy Storage Association came out with a December report on long duration storage. And the conclusions were that about 50 gigawatts of long duration energy storage are going to be needed to support the California's 2045 goals. But 2 to 11 gigawatts would be required by 2030. And when you look at comparing that to how much has actually been deployed in the state over the last decade, it's 150 times increase of what has been deployed. So for scale, that might help.
And Noel, just the biggest storage facilities are the pumped hydro storage facilities that were built a long time ago. So they've been around for a long time. We sometimes forget that stuff's there because we get excited about the new stuff. But there's a lot of storage already on the system that's been there for a long time.
That's like what, 90% of our storage capacity right now? Something like that.
More than that. Yeah, there's like 23 gigawatts of pumped storage hydropower.
Well, thank you for the answers. Next question here is from John Cervini. What examples of utility tariffs or other payment mechanisms are in place today that adequately compensate long duration storage? As an example, if a device only gets discharged once every week, month, every 3 months, how does it make sufficient revenue?
I would just jump in here and say that it's I don't think there's any truly identified kind of mechanisms yet. Again, because I mean, here in California, though, at least, a lot of our evaluation of these projects are highly dependent on the capacity payment, so resource adequacy payments. And I would say, just as a scale, it represents more than half of the revenue that we expect to gain as an avoided resource adequacy cost. So I would say that represents a lot. But now if you pull to kind of the scenario, the example was maybe charge and discharge maybe once or a couple days a week, that's a little bit difficult to try and value there, because one of the second thing on the list there would be the energy arbitrage and ancillary services. So the energy market opportunities for revenue.
I'll chime in a bit as well. I do think that the picture is changing quickly, but also increasingly you are seeing all sorts RFOs for just capacity or even for energy. So for regulated utilities, for example, and increasingly renewables plus probably lithium ion plus multi-day storage will be cost competitive in those all source RFOs for just the base product, which is dispatchable energy. Forget that it's renewables at all, because coal is getting retired, right? This is for the inexorable trend, and generally had been replaced by combined cycle natural gas. That is increasingly a difficult proposition, right? The Indiana PUC just recently rejected a proposal to build a combined cycle plant because of risk of stranded cost to the ratepayers. So that trade is just increasingly hard. And so I think what we're going to see pretty quickly here is basically multiple types of technologies on the generation side, wind and solar, let's say, and on the storage side, lithium ion and multi-day storage or other form of long duration storage, providing the least cost solution for the thing that's getting sourced, which is just energy or capacity. So we do need to be more precise about some of the values, absolutely, as I'm not going to contradict myself on that point. On the other hand, I do think that the procurement mechanisms are out there, can be sufficient because of just how cheap the stuff is getting. You can compete on a par basis out there, in certain territories for energy and capacity as it's currently designed.
And because Mateo mentioned, I'll just mention that DOE is hosting a 2-day workshop today, and I think it's actually Thursday and Friday, about combining solar and storage and demand response. So folks might be interested in that.
We haven't mentioned storage as a transmission asset, which is kind of an interesting kind of avenue for stored resources. It's that in lieu of being an energy, kind of a traditional way of procuring as a resource on the grid, it situates itself in kind of areas where instead of putting in some sort of higher price transmission line, you store that storage and you reduce congestion in those areas, and it would be kind of it replaces that transmission and is an asset there. So that's another kind of avenue that I think hasn't been mentioned but is an opportunity.
Thank you very much.
I would add that is something that's important to look at, but also to understand if it's going to be valued as transmission, is it going to be valued as generation, and because that has a big impact to us on how costs are figured out.
Well, great, thank you for the answers. Moving along, next question is from Jasmine Melvin. FERC has taken steps to improve market participation for storage and distributed resources. Is that enough? Do you continue to see regulatory hurdles in your way?
While these guys think about it, I just want to say that getting the cost, so there's one thing, like assessing the value of storage is one thing, and I think is a little more straightforward. Getting the compensation right for storage is a separate question from how much is storage worth to the system, and those pieces both have to be aligned for things to work. And so I'll just lay that as the first piece, and let these guys who work with more real systems comment on anything else there.
I mean, some of the recent FERC rulings are helpful, but there's more work to be done for sure, to the point that Jan just raised around sort of clarifying participation and compensation, really, transmission assets. The FERC has cleared the way for storage to participate in the markets, on an even basis, but that doesn't mean that the work is done there. On the other hand, the question is, well, who's responsible, or where should we try and move the conversation? Is it at the FERC? Is it at the ISOs? Is it at the state PUCs? And probably the answer is it's all of those. So there's no silver bullet here. It's progress across all these different jurisdictions, and essentially removing barriers to participation. That's really where you're at. Is make sure that there's that we're not creating unintentional barriers to new technologies showing up. And on the grid, to be perfectly honest, pumped hydro notwithstanding, storage is a relatively new technology, especially distributed storage. And so that still needs to be worked out and is getting worked out. It's, there are discussions at all the ISOs and, basically all the state level regulatory bodies, but there's still a lot more work to do. And, I hate to harp on it, but we need to make sure that we are modeling the right kind of future in order to be able to point to the kinds of things from a policy or regulatory standpoint that can be improved to incentivize those technologies and make the grid cheap and reliable.
Great, thank you. We've had a couple questions on seasonal storage, so I kind of want to open it up for your thoughts on that, as well as the specific question from Gary Krellenstein. Is there research on seasonal storage, and what type of technologies would be employed? It does not appear to be something that batteries can address.
Well, again, batteries could address it. It's just a really expensive battery if you're going to build a seasonal lithium-ion battery. That costs a lot of money. You'll get other things that are a lot cheaper. There is a lot of, there's so many ideas out there in terms of seasonal storage. If you should, like, from the academic literature side that I live a lot in, there's ideas out there all the time and new papers coming out. I'm like, hey, here's the thing. Going from the idea to actually getting something that could be built in a market is a pretty big gap. And a lot of them are, location specific. There's great pumped hydro resources in very specific locations, so it's not like you could deploy it anywhere. Or this technology needs salt caverns to store the hydrogen, and so if you replace with salt caverns, that's great. So I feel like it's a wide open space for seasonal storage. That there's some stuff closer to market than others, but it's still it's still a long ways from being settled of like, hey, here's the best options.
I would say we don't need seasonal storage. What we need is reliable energy year round. And we need to presume that the solution is being able to store a kilowatt hour for months on end and take it out at the back end of those few months. Wind and solar are very complementary in terms of their seasonality. And increasingly, we're going to have, California is probably going to have offshore wind at some point. Offshore wind is coming to the East Coast of the United States. Certainly wind is present in onshore all the way throughout the country. So it through a combination of resources, what ends up happening is you don't have to have seasonal storage per se. You have to have energy year round. That's the thing you're trying to solve for. And in non-standard meteorological years, absolutely, solve for the 1 in 20 year events as well. But again, the challenge is not in the end going to be, taking a kilowatt hour of excess summer sun and putting it into winter. That's not going to be the challenge.
I think the flip side there, Mateo, is that if it gets cheap enough, that's what people will do. This is all about it's about evaluating your options and finding the least cost solution. So I agree 100% with what you're saying. That it's really, we have to do that engineering work to say what are the best options to do that. Maybe you overbuild wind and solar because wind and solar are so cheap. They just, let's build too much and turn it off during parts of the year when we don't need it, and that's fine too. So there's so many options for what this looks like. You have to do the work. And you have to do it right to be able to really understand what are the best solutions.
Yeah, I think there is a need for seasonal storage, and maybe the way we're thinking about it is different. But I think someone earlier talked about, our snowpack is our seasonal storage, and maybe we need to look to nature as to what kinds of systems are out there that how can we replicate what's already happening so that we can have that available to us to use during the times of the year that we need it.
Yeah, and there is an optimal amount of overbuild that happens because it is so cheap, and we'll just have, that's a feature of the really cheap intermittent generation resource, and we'll have a lot of it.
Great, well, thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question here. Questions from Robert Montgomery. What role does building a more interconnected grid between states have in offsetting storage needs and creating greater grid reliability?
Well, I think that's.
Go ahead, Jan.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if we had perfect transmission, we wouldn't need storage at all, right? But that's the limiting case. Go ahead, Jan.
Yeah, I think what we learned, for example, in California's extreme heat storm last summer, is that we can rely on other grids. We can rely on the Pacific Northwest and California if it's done right. The problem with that heat storm was that there were exports happening from California that had been put together before that happened, and so our reliance on imports from the Pacific Northwest wasn't available because the market didn't foresee what was going to happen. So whether it's storage or just planning better for the extreme weather that we're starting to see is really important across the country. We know what's happening here in California. Texas has now joined us as another place that needs to think ahead, and we're just going to have to change our way of thinking and try to conceive of things that we didn't think about 10 or 20 years ago. It's a new world.
Yeah, just from my prior experience at the California ISO, just one thing is the intention there with the energy imbalance market is maybe a precursor for what we think of a Western regional market is. And the benefits and opportunities there is that when you are kind of managing a day ahead and planning purposes and not just a real-time market that it is today, you have the ability to foresee kind of these issues that will happen and maybe transact energy. But you also can't just gold plate the transmission system and hope to just kind of move energy around. There's always going to be congestion in local areas. And that's where I think siting storage resources in these local areas that energy cannot come in or maybe can't even go out is going to be key. So I don't necessarily think that the a larger transmission grid, because we see it in cases in the other RTOs out there, that really solves anything. I think long duration storage will still be a very pivotal solution. Again, not one silver bullet, we've said it a couple times now, but multiple solutions are on the table here.
And I just want to throw out kind of a hybrid solution, thinking about transmission versus the grid. And that's something we're working on at Berkeley Lab, which is batteries on wheels, which is this crazy but cool concept of considering looking at our train grid. Like the trains around the country are all diesel electric. So what if we could put a big battery car on each one, turn them into electric, therefore clean, which has huge environmental justice implications, but also now you can shoot these batteries where you need to if there's an emergency in California, emergency in Texas, and you end up with 250 gigawatt hours of transportable mobile storage. So it's just something we've been working on. And I like thinking about the systems level stuff and not necessarily stuck on the infrastructure that we feel that we're stuck with.
Well, I hate to jump in because this has been such a fascinating conversation, but that's a great place to do it, because to end on that creative approach to using our train grid to create emergency capacity, it's just a great place to end. You know, I think I speak for everyone, and this conversation could go on for hours. I really want to thank Noel, you, Mateo, Jan, Eric, Wesley, for a fascinating conversation. You know, I just can't imagine that 5 years ago we could have talked about a cost-effective energy solution that basically comprised renewables with lithium ion and multi-day storage as, you know, a potentially economic solution to something. And it's remarkable where we are, but you all, I think, shared with everyone where you think things are going. In fact, I do want to point out to everybody who's in our audience that the Our Energy Library, which is part of the OEP website, includes a lot of the studies and reports, including the NREL study that Wesley was talking about, so that as you all are working on this and other issues, please take advantage of all of the reports, studies, and materials in the Our Energy Library. We weren't able to get to all the questions, which we felt was going to be the case, but we will have a discussion online at the OEP site. Encourage all of you to participate in that conversation, weigh in with your thoughts on what our phenomenal panel discussed today. And thank you very much for taking the time to join us. Thanks again to our partners for supporting us. Please look out for our next in our webinar series coming up in a couple of weeks. For everyone, stay well, stay healthy, and thanks once again to our phenomenal panel and their discussion today. Have a great rest of the week, and thank you to all.